Yeah.
Hello, heretics. I am Lilith of Lilith Liberated. I'm here with Rene of Renevelation. We are Veritas Voices. Thank you for your patience while I was gone moving. I know we had a little bit of a gap in programming. These things happen. Uh, I'm still in a little bit of chaos, but I've got all my stuff and I will eventually make sense of it at some point, somehow.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I'll find my way out of the chaos. But today we wanted to discuss something that gets people's hackles up a lot online and is a really clear, it's an indicator of the different moral values and different moral appeals that underline free-thinking humanist positions versus the especially the conservative Christian and conservative religious positions. And that is the topic of abortion. And Rene, you actually wanted to bring this up
Yeah.
to discuss some of the intellectual arguments that you've used in the past and how people have responded to them.
Yeah.
Um, what was it that you found most important to address about this issue?
Well, first of all, I think the issue is not really about what pro-lifers typically argue when life begins. I think the issue is whether a given human has the right to use another human's body in order to survive or in order to live. But first of all, I think it would be wise to sort of get a little bit of background information on the Christian perspective, because, as you know, I am from a deist that don't really understand the Christian rationale
No, that's fair.
behind the
That's
pro-life
fair. And
position.
a
So,
lot of people don't. And I
so
think that's reasonable-ish that a lot of
yeah,
people don't understand that. Um, there's the thing is about the Christian perspective, and I think this has to inform how you deal with it. It's not that it's reasonable, it's that it is completely emotionally based. And I don't mean that incidentally. I mean that that is how it is. A very careful campaign has been done to foster emotional, moral outrage to pump it up to levels where they will not hear the other side. Um, when you say abortion, it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It doesn't matter who's involved, how old they are, anything that involves all a Christian hears is baby killing. They hear you advocating for killing babies, no matter what you say after the word abortion, um, which is insanity and completely false. But it doesn't matter. And one thing that does do, yeah, for one, it insulates them from ever even listening to your perspective. But the other thing it does is feeds into this idea that, the liberal, secular, or even other, Christians of a less fanatical stripe have no moral grounding, no moral anything, that they're just, willing to do anything, no matter what the consequences for their own godless, immoral lifestyle.
yeah,
And however crazy that may sound, that's that is what the position that they take, but the position they've been trained to take. And I'll give
yeah,
you an example. There are different ways to perform an abortion, dependent on the circumstances involved and how far along the pregnancy is, and all of these things. So it's not just simple, you know, A, B, C. You might have different reasons for performing an abortion. You might be at a different stage. There was I, I hesitate to use the phrase, but it is accurate, Christian rap song
yes,
that involved basically that, it involved going over explicitly and in the most like gross and inciting ways possible all the different ways that an abortion could be performed. And there was one particular where it went over because there's situations where later term abortions are performed, not because the pregnancy is unwanted, but because something has gone horribly wrong. And they would do this in a way to preserve the baby because the parents involved would be mourning the loss. And they made this sound, just as terrible and disgusting as they could. And it was really abusive, and it made us all cry, unsurprisingly. But it was a way to keep people feeling like they were the only voice of reason in the middle of a Holocaust. And that's the kind of attitude and thought that has been assiduously just groomed and tailored and nurtured in the religious right, so that anything you say is just you being a Nazi who wants to kill 1 million babies.
Yeah.
And there's no reasoning with that.
One thing which I did want to ask you is, because I've asked this question recently on Twitter, within the replies to a tweet by Franklin Graham, what is sort of the biblical basis for deeming abortion to be murder? Like, are there certain verses on which they would base this conclusion?
Well, just the general idea of do not kill. And there's also an underlying idea that nobody has the right to cause you misery but God. It's sort of like you have to, it's like the same way that they oppose euthanasia. It's not about mercy. It's about not taking power away from God to say when your life begins and when it ends.
Wait a minute. I don't get that. Like, wouldn't it be within God's control to sort of stop you from aborting or to stop you from performing euthanasia? I mean,
no, he can do that. Well, that's the thing, is that God can kill you, but you can't kill yourself, because that would, as we discussed in our last episode with Crazy Christian Tweets, there's this entire underlying attitude of slavery. And this applies to everyone, but it applies especially to women. And there's something quite interesting that happened to me. My mother is pro-life and raised me pro-life, but at the same time, she's kind of one of those very conflicted individuals who would like slag off feminists, but really was a feminist, just, bought into the narrative that most of the feminists were these evil, man-hating, blah, blah, blah. And she explained it to me in the context of birth control, because birth control is something else that the more fundamentalist right wing try to pull away. And she talked about my grandmother, who had 5 children. And after her 4th child, and they were very poor, and she just begged the doctor to tie her tubes. And he wouldn't. He said, have 1 more baby and then I'll do it. And I mean, nowadays, that's a horrific idea that a doctor would, think that they have the right to tell you how many children to have. But in those days, it wasn't nearly as uncommon as you would think and hope, quite frankly. And that's the thing, was that it was an element of control over women's bodies, but it was also an element of control over the poor. Because children are expensive. Yeah. Feeding a child, raising them until they're 18 years old, educating them, clothing them, putting a roof over their head, and the emotional and physical investment just behind, taking care of their needs and training them, and even just, outside of like schooling, in a country like this, you can send them to school, obviously, but at the same time, you've still got to teach them a lot of things before that. And she said it was part because if you have a lot of children, it will keep you poor. preventing the poor from having access to birth control is one of the ways that the rich have kept themselves rich, because there have always been ways to limit pregnancy, and they kept them and kept the poor from having them, so that the poor would absolutely have to spend their money because they had to take care of their children, and they could never get out of that poverty, out of that level of living hand to mouth. And there's a kind of desperation that comes with that. And when she explained it to me, I mean, it was very clearly the case. It was also kind of terrifying to think of things in those terms. But it's true. It's part of a power dynamic. And another part of the power dynamic has to do with controlling women. So it's, she didn't focus on that as much in that conversation, but it was pretty clear. And I'm glad, because years later, and I still remember what she taught me and say, you can see the underlying goals behind these kinds of attitudes. So anyway.
Yeah. So you were sort of raised pro-life, right?
Very much so.
The parents' side of, how did they sort of explain this position to you, and how did they explain why the other position, the position that we take nowadays, is not reasonable? Did it just boil down to baby killing, or did they actually tackle also some of the objections that people like pro-choicers like?
Oh God, no. This is part of the dialogue, is when a woman says it's my body, it's my choice, they take that to mean that she thinks the fetus's body is literally her body, and that she's therefore refusing to make a distinction between the two, and that it's a lie. They don't talk about it in terms of rights or bodily autonomy. It's a pretty standard straw man, which I'm realizing more and more is the only defense right-wing conservatives have for anything they say. So yeah, what are you going to do?
So they didn't really deal honestly with sort of the philosophical arguments, or...
Oh, and in fairness, I don't think they had studied philosophical arguments with regard to it. It sounded like baby killing to them, and that's what everyone said it was. And there's a lot of people who just get caught up in the outrage, and it seems perfectly reasonable to them to be outraged. And of course, if someone was just killing a million babies because convenience, that would be a thing to get outraged about. Then, which is literally how they see it. So yeah, there are a lot of people who sort of go unthinkingly into this, and once they've got to the point of, and it is represented as, a Holocaust, and they have pictures of aborted fetuses next to pictures of the dead from Hitler's concentration camps. It's all very, very manipulative and dramatic. And
so it is sort of literally this emotional basis, and once you have this emotional basis, then you're not really open to the other perspective concerning this. Because one thing which I did read recently on Twitter was a pastor, Pastor Mike Winger. He was saying it would be, or something along those lines, it would be great if people who are offended by pictures of abortions were just as offended by abortions. But the thing is, at least for me, why I am offended by pictures of abortions is because they're used as an appeal to emotion rather than a logical argument.
Absolutely. And you've had a logical argument that you bring up quite honestly and quite frequently that actually sidesteps the argument over whether a fetus is a person, even in the early stages of development, when there's literally no one there to experience the nerve, like there's not enough brain for there to be a person experiencing anything.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the pro-choice versus pro-life debate goes, as far as I'm concerned, there's really only one argument I make, and really only one argument, for me at least, which I find to be the one that needs to be talked about. I think it's the most relevant argument within the entire debate, and I think it's an argument that pro-lifers don't tend to be familiar with, but I think it's the best argument that the pro-choice side has. It is called the Violinist thought experiment. It's a thought experiment proposed within the philosophy of ethics, and I will sort of lay out the scenario, and then I will also address, or we can address together, how pro-lifers tend to react to the argument, what objections they bring up, and why we think that these objections do not hold water.
Sure, absolutely.
So
take us over the argument in its most basic form.
Yeah. So the violinist experiment. Let's say that you are a person and you want to go to a concert from a famous violinist, and you go to the concert, but then you're abducted by the Music Lovers Society. They are fans of the violinist, and the next morning you find yourself surgically attached to the violinist, like sort of your you have like a tube in your arm where there's blood transferred to a sort of bag, and the same is true for the violinist. Like
you're hooked up to the violinist in some medical fashion.
Yes.
Whatever it is.
Yes. And the nurse that informs you tells you that the violinist will die soon if you unplug yourself from this surgical attachment to him. But if you stay 9 months with him, if you stay attached to him for 9 months, then he will be cleared. He will be completely healthy, and you will basically have saved a life. The question now becomes: are you morally obligated to stay hooked to the violinist, or are you not, or can you unplug yourself from the violinist and not have done more wrong, so to speak? So
yeah, and that's
question that we address.
I think the good thing about that argument is that even though it is there are many very good scientific reasons to argue that a fetus is not a human being, especially in the early stages where it is, at most a potential human being, but certainly not in any sense a fully actualized one. You totally skip that element of it and say, okay, fine, we'll just pretend it is. It isn't, but we will pretend it is. How does that then negate your right to personal physical autonomy? And that's a large part of the argument that is misrepresented by pro-lifers. The idea that it's my body, it's my choice. No, I'm not saying the fetus body is my body. I'm saying my body is my body, and you may not use it without my consent.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are a lot of objections to this by Christians. I think, honestly, I get the feeling off of a lot of them that it's more a case of not wanting to. It's a good argument, and they don't want to admit that, so they kind of, and I can't. It's not right to assume everyone's motivations, for sure. It's not right really to assume anyone's motivations, but let's just say that's the impression I have received on some occasions. I will not say that I know that certainly to be true of any individual persons, but it is the impression I have received, and it is likely true of at least some occasions, but yeah.
Personally, I did encounter pro-lifers who say that this is a strong argument, but they don't think that it holds up for reason X, Y, Z, and I think one or the most frequent objection that I get is basically that this is not analogous at all because the person was abducted by the Music Lover Society and took to the Violinist. He didn't consent to this whole thing, while the mother-to-be or the pregnant woman did consent to sex, so it's not at all analogous. But
right, so then it's only
obvious,
valid in cases of rape because then you really didn't consent. And that is honestly, that is the part of it that makes me the most sick because of the attitude underneath that it demonstrates. Because the attitude underneath that is that women's sexuality, it's restrictive of women's sexuality, but it's also very degrading to women's sexuality. The idea is not that men have sex and that is an instant consent to, you know, not only to being a parent, but to actually undergoing a pregnancy, which I point out can be life-threatening very, very easily. Even a regular pregnancy can absolutely fucking kill you. Just gonna put that out there. It's this idea that, yeah, it's this degrading of women's sexuality that if a woman has sex, she has in some sense consented or partially consented to pregnancy. And, you know, that's obviously, honestly, it's pretty much the same as victim blaming culture. You know, if you didn't want to be raped, you shouldn't have worn that. You shouldn't have gone down that road or that path or spent time with people who, you know, have questionable, or you shouldn't have been drinking. It's the exact same thing. It really is. As disgusting as that is, it's that same attitude of, you don't have the rights I have because you have a vagina. You have to justify your value and your personal autonomy in this situation because it's now contingent because as a woman you had sex or you did any number of other things. And this is a lot of what the moral outrage about purity culture is. It's not about the men. People who want to be fair-minded will pretend that it's just as incumbent on men. But I mean, we look at the conservative religious groups and you can plainly see in practice that's not at all what happens. I mean, you want to talk about the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. It's not just there. It's the Southern Baptist Convention, the Independent Fundamentalist Southern Baptists, especially the Jehovah's Witnesses, all of these groups, you know, massive child sexual abuse, other forms of sexual abuse, always made, you know, enabled by and empowered by an authoritarian culture that puts men in charge of women and controls women's sexuality in relationship to men's choices. It's that the men's choices decide. And that is fucking disgusting and it's absolutely infuriating. And no, I can have all the bloody sex I want with anyone I want, and that does not mean that any man has the right to dictate anything about me. Yes. And it's oh God, they're just disgusting.
But I would personally say, in response to these people who say that you consent to sex, therefore you consent to pregnancy, is that we can sort of adapt the experiment a little bit. Let's say that the people who abducted you, they didn't actually abduct you. You said, yeah, they approached you and they said, well, listen, sir or ma'am, we have this violinist, he's sick to death, and as we heard, you have the same blood type. If you were to come with us and if you were to hook yourself to the violinist and stay with him for 9 months, we would certainly appreciate it. You would do a great service, you would save a life, and you would say, yeah, sounds like a bit of a burden, but okay, I will do it. And then at a later point, you then may be thinking, well, okay, I changed my mind. I don't want to stay hooked to the violinist. I want to go free. Would you at that point be prohibited to unplug yourself from the
And
violinist?
I think you might. I think you might. An argument could be made, or at least, to find someone else to take the place or something like that, because you could do that in an external situation. There might actually be an ethical problem there if you had openly agreed. But that's the thing. Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy.
Yeah.
And if you think it is, we will find a way to put babies in men. And then the man who had sex, force them to carry the child to term and see how fast they're fine with abortion.
I mean, personally, I would say that you would still be justified to unplug yourself at that point, even if you openly agree to it. I mean, maybe you couldn't say that like 1 week before the violinist was to be completely healed, but I would say at least in the first weeks in the relevant, maybe in the first third, where
a 30-day money back guarantee.
Yeah, or a 90-day or something like that. But I mean, with pregnancy, it's still probabilistic. I mean, if you were to heard news that people were getting abducted by these music lovers, and that you could potentially end up being abducted, or I think that would be more analogous to the violence thing. And
that
then
would be more analogous,
could,
because again, I don't even want to pretend at any point that consent to sex is consent to pregnancy, because it fucking isn't, and I will not let that stand. It's a horrible way to try and control women and women's bodies, and like people think that can fuck right off. But at the same time, yeah, nobody has the right to use my body without my consent. Especially nobody has the right to put me in a situation where I risk my life without my fucking consent. And that's what pregnancy always does. There is, it's 100%, that is a life-risking thing. It can also be a very wonderful and noble thing, but let's not pretend it's not what it is. And yeah.
One more thing which I do want to say about that is I also want to talk sort of about the nature of consent. And I think because I think they get the nature of consent wrong, and for that I want to present a sort of different thought experiment. Let's say you are a woman who has a boyfriend who was formally convicted of rape. He has done his time, but he is now out of prison. And you sort of hear the rumor that one of your former friends whom he has been with in the past, he has been rather violent, and the sex has also been kind of violent with her, but nevertheless you choose him as a boyfriend, and you choose to have sex with him. You agree to have sex with him. And then during the sex with him, you realize, well, that doesn't feel too good, so I will say to him that he should please stop having sex with you.
You withdraw consent during the sex because something goes wrong.
Yeah, but
whatever that may be.
But at that point, he continues, and at that point, you did agree to consensual sex first, but what you did not agree to was to getting raped, and at that point, it did turn into rape, and at that point.
But see, all those other elements are attempts to victim blame. All those other elements are, granted, it's a pretty stupid idea to date a guy who you know is a rapist. That, or, you know,
I would admit that it's also stupid that having sex without contraception would also be pretty stupid, but the law protects stupid people as well.
Right? Yeah, no, it does. Absolutely. And that's the thing too, is that people are victims of manipulation. There's all kinds of things. It's not, and like, I don't even like going over things like that, because I know that it's an attempt to victim blame, attempt to say that, oh, because the woman, made a dumb choice or perhaps was manipulated or whatever else, then everything that follows is at least partly her fault, no matter what follows. And I'm like, No, being dumb is not ideal. Doesn't mean you consented to be raped. Making a dumb decision, not best. Does not mean it's like the attitude with men and purity culture and modesty culture, which is pretty much, it's an outlier of the same thing. The idea that you should be responsible for men's thought lives in what you wear. And like, that is bullshit, and it can fuck right off. Because let me tell you something. I don't care if I walk down the street absolutely naked, doing cartwheels and screaming like a banshee. That does not give any man the right to put his hands on me sexually.
Yeah.
It might, depending on where I am, give the cops the right to restrain me if I'm doing something illegal, because there are places where you cannot do naked cartwheels and scream like a banshee. But even that does not give them sexual permission over my body.
I agree 100%. And I think that the example that I just brought up with rape, it illustrates the nature of consent, that you can withdraw consent if something goes wrong, like consent to sex is not consent to rape, and consent to sex is not consent to a baby.
No, it isn't.
And while the pro-lifers would draw objections with me sort of drawing a parallel between rape and pregnancy, the larger point here is that consent to thing X is not consent to the outcome. And in one case, the outcome is rape, and in the other case, the outcome is pregnancy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, as far as I'm concerned, the objection that she agreed to it and that she gave consent, it really doesn't hold water
No, it doesn't.
If you look at it more closely.
But that's
something that Christians would probably not agree with, that you can agree initially as a violinist and then unplug yourself later, even though you agreed. But that would be my position, and that would be sort of a position that one could talk about reasonably. But the position with pregnancy not being 100% certain outcome, I think that we can draw many analogies where we should say that the violinist can unplug herself, and therefore the woman can unplug herself as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the thing. It's not about whether or not you personally would stay plugged in. I think a lot of us would in that situation, especially because the violinist in that case is an actual fully realized person with talent and a full capacity for suffering and all the rest of it. I think I would probably insist on some manner of compensation, but I would probably stay plugged in that circumstance. That's not the question. The question is
whether you have to.
Are you obligated? Absolutely. And that's the thing where it's like, no, you don't have the right to say, I must.
Yeah.
And yeah, would you is different from must you. These are not the same question. And that's, I think, where it's important to make that clear in the violinist experiment.
That's also something which I say a lot when they say that I'm pro-abortion. No, I'm not pro-abortion at all. If a woman says, yeah, I want to carry out that pregnancy, I want to give birth to the baby, then I say, all hail to you. That's great of you. You are willing to make sacrifices to your body. You are willing to carry out the baby. That's good on you. I'm glad for every woman who carries out a pregnancy, but I don't think I have the right to tell her that she must.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That is my position.
Well, and that's the part where I'm like, okay, yeah, yeah, by all means. Nobody likes abortion. Abortion is not like, oh, goody, let's get one of those. I almost have my free one. Get 9 stamps and your 10th is free. Like, that's not how that works. Nobody's like, yippee-ki-yay. Life is hard and messy, and there are times where things suck.
Yeah. Also, if you want, we can tackle sort of another objection which I also often run into, or
Please do.
not as often, but also on occasion. Another objection would be the distinction between actively killing the baby and or the fetus. Doesn't really matter for the purpose of the violinist experiment and letting it die, right? I mean, when you unplug yourself from the violinist, it's not like you stab him in the heart and then you run off, but you simply unplug yourself. But one thing which I did do, because I wrote a blog post on this, I sort of proposed a new experiment, which is the violinist in a saw trap experiment.
Oh, interesting.
So let's say that you are in a saw trap, like you know saw.
Yeah.
And John Kramer tells you that you can either stay hooked to the violinist for 9 months, and he will give you food. He has ensured that, and you know that he doesn't lie. You know that from paper articles that he keeps his word, but you have to stay hooked to him for 9 months. And if you don't, then there will be there's sort of samurai swords on the ceiling. And if you unplug yourself, then these swords will crash down on the violinist and cut him in 1,000 pieces.
Yeah.
In that case, you would not just let the violinist die, but you would actively kill him and you would dismember him.
Yuck.
Would that make a moral difference? I don't think it would.
It might, but that's the thing. This is getting into more and more complex territory, and there would be an element of, where are the lines here? There would be an element of debate about that. But at the same time, the principle of I have the right to autonomy over my physical body is still a very important, you can't ignore that part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that that just because the violinist is now not just gonna die, but also gonna be sliced into 1,000 pieces.
Yeah.
Therefore, you cannot unplug yourself. I definitely wouldn't.
You might choose not to, and I would applaud that choice. But
are you obligated based on the fact
is it a choice? Is the question. There's a difference between, like I said before, there's a difference between what might I do and what is it my right to choose.
Yeah, I mean, would we be willing to say that before, when you weren't in a saw trap, you had every right to unplug yourself from the violinist, but now that the violinist will die more violently, now you don't have that right anymore? Would we be willing to go that far?
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't, but also there's another way to tackle this is, let's say that someday we found a method where we can simply take the fetus and remove him from the womb and then lay him on the table and let him die there. Like there's no physical harm done, it just gets put on the table and then it will die there. No violence, no
I don't see that as being more moral. Like, I don't even remotely see that as being more moral. I think there would be less moral, actually, because you're increasing potential suffering depending on the stage that the fetus is at.
But the person who is doing the or who makes the objection between actively killing and merely letting die would have to accept that if we get a better way to abort babies or fetuses, and if we simply lay on the table and let it die there, then they would have to become pro-choice. And I'm not sure whether they would bite that bullet.
Oh, I don't think they would at all. But at the same time, I think it outlines how disingenuous the entire system is in a lot of cases. Because the objections are, I think, more viscerally and emotionally driven. They certainly felt that way when I was on that side of the argument, that just the no, I can't accept or even consider. And
So
again,
we need to come up with objections somehow.
Instantly, because there's a great physical and emotional discomfort, not surprisingly, especially when it's all about, when you've bought into this idea that you're just wantonly killing babies for fucking kicks or whatever. Then there's a visceral no reaction, and you just no, and I get that, but then it becomes impossible to explain to them that that's not actually what abortion is, and the reasons are not what you think they are, and the entire situation is far more complex than you've been led to believe. There's just this blank wall in the mind of shutting down, and it's a tremendously effective strategy, but it's an incredibly abusive strategy too.
Yeah, and like this is also like the one thing which I often hear from pro-life is that it's an innocent baby, and you can't just kill innocent humans. But as the Violinist experiment demonstrates, or as other thought experiments which I could propose demonstrate, there are situations where you can even kill innocent humans.
You know what changed my mind?
What did change your mind? I would love to hear it.
Well, it started the process, and I'm gonna write an article about this in a little more detail. But there was an account written by a doctor who had been at the site of a catastrophe. It was an engineering catastrophe. There was a collapse of part of a building, and because of this design change at the last minute, malfunction, and all the rest of it. And he said, he was writing about it, and he said, you as a doctor, you take the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, but you don't realize, that comes to mean something very different when you're looking at having to cut through living flesh to get to a human being to get them out. Do I amputate this guy's leg to pull this other guy out? Do I let this person die because they're so far gone that in the time it would take to save them, I could save 3 other people, and I don't even know that I can? I'm making decisions like that. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible, but those are the decisions that first responders and doctors have to make, because there isn't always a simple answer. And it isn't just, if you do the right thing, everything will work out. It isn't that way. It hasn't been. It's never been. And no one has known that historically more than women. So ultimately, no matter what the circumstances, I'm going to say that women have always had to make the hard choices.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to make them harder.
I agree 100% with that.
Thanks. But I think that's actually as much of that as I can take right now. I think I'm going to go have some milk chocolate and, I don't know, do something nice.
Enjoy the rest of your day, because it's not an easy conversation to have, and it's not easy to tackle this position, which I think you and I both agree is not reasonable and a little
quite
bit
difficult. Yeah. Well, at the very least, we'll get some rest, and I'll find a bit of chocolate. Chocolate never makes things worse.
Yeah.
All right. I'll talk to you soon, Rene. Take care of yourself.
Yeah, you too, Lilith. And goodbye to all of yours. I hope you enjoyed today's topic.
Absolutely. Reason bless, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah.